How is Angel Island reflecting of America's very complicated and controversial relationship to immigration? So on the one hand, it is a symbol of everything that went wrong with Asian immigration. It's a story of exclusion. It's a story of really drastic, racist, discriminatory immigration laws that singled out Asian immigrants for a particular type of treatment and exclusion. But it is also a place where 500,000 people from 80 different countries around the world did manage to enter the United States, and many of their stories are very similar to the narratives that we hear from Ellis Island, that they came in search of work, of home, of freedom. And when we talk to them and their descendants, they do describe, many of them, yes, the time on Angel Island was very difficult, and yes, we were singled out for treatment. However, I'm still glad that I came because I was able to take advantage of the opportunities of the United States. So it's this very interesting, complicated place. It is a gateway to America, an immigrant gateway to America, but it was also a place of exclusion and detention and deportation. And in that way, it's a fascinating place to study. It helps us understand this very complicated relationship that America has had with immigration since its founding. Who should we let into the country? Who should we keep out? What processes, what laws do we put into place to make those decisions? And then what we were interested in, because as social historians we're interested in the stories of immigrants themselves, is how did these laws and how did their experience on Angel Island actually affect immigrants themselves, their families, and their communities? Angel Island was the immigration station for San Francisco. It was built in 1910, opened on January 21st, 1910, and it was in operation for 30 years. It closed after a fire burnt down its administration building in August of 1940. And in that time period, so early 20th century, the United States is in the midst of one could say its first great debate over immigration. It's a period of mass migration of people coming in from around the world, and it's also a time of the United States really enforcing its borders for the first time, passing a series of immigration laws that it is increasingly restricting and narrowing that door and deciding who can be let in and who could be let out. And historians really mark the beginning of this period of restriction with 1875 and 1882. 1875 is the first time that the United States passes a law. It's the Page Act of 1875. It restricts the immigration of people who are considered to be coming in as contract laborers and women suspected of being prostitutes. And it's specifically geared towards Chinese immigrant men as contract laborers and Chinese immigrant women. It's a first step. It was a pretty limited law, but it was the first step that really then led to a series of other laws. And the really transformative one is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which again, like its name implies, focuses on Chinese immigrants, but is the first time in U.S. history where our country excludes an immigrant group based on race and class. So all Chinese laborers, which of course was the largest group of Chinese coming in, are barred. All Chinese, regardless of their occupational status, are banned, are prohibited from becoming naturalized citizens. And the only Chinese who are allowed into the country are visitors and teachers, travelers, students, diplomats, and merchants. So a very elite group of migrants, those who are considered to be temporary, who are professionals. And again, this is a very small proportion of Chinese who want to come to the United States, the prospective migrants. By the time Angel Island closes in 1940, all other Asian immigrant groups had been either greatly restricted or absolutely banned. So Japanese laborers are barred in 1907. All Japanese immigrants are banned by 1924. South Asians are banned by 1917. Even Filipinos who had been able to come to the United States as quote-unquote U.S. nationals traveling from one part of the U.S. empire to another part of the U.S. empire had been banned by 1935. And of course, there are restrictions placed on Southern and Eastern Europeans in 1921 and 1924. And it's at Angel Island that we can see how these immigration policies get developed, how they get enforced, and what the impact is on immigrants themselves. It's a fascinating place to study how all of these different things come together. So one of the things that we really aim to do with looking at this new history of Angel Island is that when we think about Angel Island, we automatically think of the Chinese immigrant and Chinese exclusion story. And that has made sense in many ways. The Angel Island Immigration Station was built in 1910 to primarily enforce the Chinese exclusion laws. And Chinese did make up the vast majority, 70% of all immigrant detainees on Angel Island. But as we were digging through the immigration files, as we were looking more closely at the statistics, as people in various different communities came forward and told us about their experiences, and as the immigration itself went through a massive renovation and restoration project, we had all of these clues about other immigrant groups. So, for example, Chinese immigrants who had been detained on Angel Island wrote poetry. They wrote and carved poems into the detention barrack walls, poems of immense sadness and frustration and anger about their treatment in the United States. But as the restoration work began at the immigration station in the past 5 years or so, the preservation specialists noticed that there were poems written in Hebrew and Punjabi and Korean and Spanish and Japanese, and we knew that there was a greater diversity of immigrants coming through. And these poems are very similar in outlook. Many of them focus on how Angel Island sounds so beautiful, but in reality, it's more like an immigrant prison. So one of my favorite poems was written by an anonymous Chinese poet. Many of the poems were not signed, and so we don't know who this person was. We know that he was male because it was carved into the walls of the men's detention barracks, but we don't know whether he was finally admitted in or whether he was deported. But his poem speaks to many of the experiences that Chinese had. I clasped my hands in parting with my brothers and classmates. Because of the mouth, I hastened to cross the American Ocean. And in this sense, the mouth means because of the search, because of hunger at home. How was I to know that the Western barbarians had lost their hearts and reason? With 100 kinds of oppressive laws, they mistreat us Chinese. So that's one of my favorite poems. Another poem that was written by a Japanese detainee, his name was Goso Yoneda, talks about Angel Island and calls it the Angel Island Detention Station. And this was published in the Japanese language newspaper. It was not carved into the walls in Angel Island. Angel Island, what a beautiful name. I would play with her until I die, but there are no angels on this island. Only nameless immigrant prisoners. Today is gone, but agony, anguish, and anxiety stay with me through the dark night until dawn. After several days of incarceration, no more tears of sadness, no more tears of anguish. I watched through the wired window toward evening. America is my country, so my birth certificate says, but America doesn't want me here. I hear sounds of different voices from the next cells, Chinese, Russian, Mexican, Greek, and Italian, voices of sorrow, nostalgia, rage, and passion. There are two other stories. We also looked at oral histories and also at immigrant writings about Angel Island. And one of the oral histories we found was of a woman. Her name was Kala Bagai. She's a South Asian woman coming in 1913. It was very rare for South Asian women to migrate to the United States at this time. It was mostly males. But she was coming with her husband, Vaishno Das Bagai, and their 3 children. And they were detained on Angel Island for a few days. And in her oral history that she gave to her granddaughter, she talked about why they came to America. Why did we come to America? The Ghadar movement wanted to take the British out of India. Mr. Begay was in that movement. He said, "I don't want to stay in the slave country. I want to go to America, where there is no slavery." So in 1915, we came. It happened to be Saturday noon, and the boat people said, "You cannot leave today, Saturday and Sunday, or Monday. The office will be open, then you can go." They put me separate with the two little boys. I couldn't speak one word of English. When the eating time came, they said, "Chow, chow, chow," so I understood that means to eat. I went over there. I didn't like the food at all, but I saw that they were selling some fruits, so I bought some fruits. The third day we left the station because we had plenty of money. There was no question about money. One of the things that the Begay family talks about is the Gadar movement, which is the Indian nationalist movement in the early 20th century that was organized in North America to help overthrow British in India. And so we see that it was very common for South Asians in the United States to become involved in Indian nationalist politics. And then the last story I wanted to share was from a visitor to Angel Island. This is Ernesto Galarza, who later became a very well-known Chicano activist and historian. And as a young boy, he travels with his family to Angel Island to visit some relatives who have come up from Mexico, who are being detained at the immigration station. And they are being detained because immigration officers do not think that the family will be able to support themselves. They think that they're not rugged enough to do the labor that is required. And so they are denied entry. And Ernesto Galarza writes about his experience going there and the way that he felt. The Lopez family were standing at the far end of the yard. My aunt, slender and poised in long skirts and shawl, Don Catarino. My cousins, Jesus and Catarino. The immigration officer, through the interpreter, was explaining the Lopezes would not be allowed to enter the United States. There were papers on the desk in front of him. He explained the rules and the laws and the orders, and they all made the same point. The family would be detained for a few days on the island and would then have to return to Mexico the way they had come. So it was hello and goodbye in one afternoon. We left them by the wharf. From the launch we waved and lost them in our wake. On the ride back, all I could think of was calling the immigration officer ugly and menacing, all the names I could think of, like Gringo Bentejo. My uncle Gustavo scowled, and he said on the train, "Es una injusticia," it's an injustice. All of these stories tell us a really complicated portrait of both immigrants' hopes in coming to the United States, the bars in relation to the immigration laws that they faced, but they are also stories of immigrant perseverance and determination, and it makes the study of Angel Island really a fascinating tale that gets at both of these themes in American immigration history. The stories of immigrants themselves is how did these laws and how did their experience on Angel Island actually affect immigrants themselves, their families, and their communities. Angel Island was the immigration station for San Francisco. It was built in 1910, opened on January 21st, 1910, and it was in operation for 30 years. It closed after a fire burnt down, and in that way, it's a fascinating place to study. It helps us understand this very complicated relationship that America has had with immigration since its founding. Who should we let into the country? Who should we keep out? What processes, what laws do we put into place to make those decisions? And then what we were interested in, because as social historians we're interested in how is Angel Island reflecting of America's very complicated and controversial relationship to immigration? So on the one hand, it is a symbol of everything that went wrong with Asian immigration. It's a story of exclusion. It's a story of really drastic racist discriminatory immigration laws that singled out Asian immigrants for a particular type of treatment and exclusion. But it is also a place where 500,000 people from 80 different countries around the world did managed to enter the United States, and many of their stories are very similar to the narratives that we hear from Ellis Island, that they came in search of work, of home, of freedom. And when we talk to them and their descendants, they do describe, many of them, yes, the time on Angel Island was very difficult, and yes, we were singled out for treatment. However, I'm still glad that I came because I was able to take advantage of the opportunities of the United States. So it's this very interesting, complicated place. It is a gateway to America, an immigrant gateway to America, but it was also a place of exclusion and detention and deportation.